The fashion world's hunger for worn-in, vintage-looking jeans ignited a new industrial fire in Istanbul's back streets. Factory owners, sensing a lucrative market, imported heavy industrial sandblasting machines. These weren't for cleaning metal, they were repurposed to artificially age denim, using compressed air to violently spray fine crystalline silica sand directly onto the fabric. The machines roared to life in converted basements and cramped workshops. With each trigger pull, a high-pressure jet of sand scoured the blue cotton, stripping away indigo to reveal the pale threads beneath. The process created the perfect, pre-faded look Western brands demanded, but it also atomized the sand into an invisible toxic mist that hung in the still air of the unventilated rooms. For the factory owners, it was a simple, profitable equation: cheap labor, cheap sand, and a machine that could transform a basic pair of jeans into a high-fashion commodity in minutes. They hired young men, often migrants from rural areas, to operate the equipment for long shifts, unaware that the very substance creating the fashionable distress was seeding a silent catastrophe in their workers' lungs. As the machines kept running, the workshops became dust chambers. Young men, many in their late teens, would stand for 10-hour shifts before the roaring sandblasting guns. With each blast, a fine grey powder erupted from the denim, hanging in the air like a permanent fog. It settled on everything: their eyelashes, the rims of their water glasses, the concrete floor that grew slick underfoot. There were no masks, no proper ventilation, just open windows that did little against the storm inside. The workers breathed it in, a gritty taste that coated their throats. At the end of a shift, they would emerge ghostly pale, their hair and work clothes transformed by a uniform layer of silica, a second skin of poison they carried home. The dust infiltrated every crevice. It clung to the walls, turning them a dull, chalky grey. It piled in corners, forming small dunes. In that suspended cloud, trillions of microscopic silica particles swirled, each one sharp as glass, small enough to be inhaled deep into the lungs with every breath the workers took, beginning a silent, irreversible invasion. The cough started as a dry, persistent hack in the workshop's dusty air, but it followed the young men home. Within months, climbing a single flight of stairs left them gasping, hands braced against walls as their chests tightened. They dismissed it as fatigue, the price of long hours, until the breathlessness refused to fade even after a full night's rest. One of them finally sought help at a hospital in Istanbul. A doctor slid his chest X-ray onto a light box, and the room fell silent. The image was not of clear, dark lung tissue, but a field of countless tiny, dense white specks scattered like snow across both lungs. It was a textbook pattern, a map of invasion written in silica. The diagnosis was silicosis. Each white nodule on the film represented a permanent scar where a particle of inhaled silica dust had been trapped by the body's defenses. The immune cells had died trying to destroy the unbreakable crystals, hardening the lungs with fibrous tissue, slowly turning the vital organs to stone from the inside out. The persistent coughs and abnormal chest X-rays that had puzzled Istanbul doctors now formed a terrifying pattern. By 2005, Turkish pulmonologists were documenting case after case of aggressive lung disease, all clustered among one group: young men who had worked in denim sandblasting workshops. Their medical reports described a condition that progressed with shocking speed, far faster than the silicosis typically seen in miners after decades of exposure. In hospital examination rooms, the young workers struggled to draw a full breath. Their lungs, once elastic and spongy, had been transformed by the invisible assault of silica. The The fine dust had triggered a brutal inflammatory response, causing scar tissue to proliferate and harden. With each inhalation, the stiffened lungs resisted expansion, forcing the chest muscles to work harder for diminishing returns of air. The pulmonologists wrote of lungs that had lost all compliance, becoming rigid and heavy. The delicate air sacs were choked with fibrous nodules, their architecture obliterated. On scans, the tissue resembled solid stone more than a functioning organ. For these men in their 20s and 30s, the simple act of breathing had become a conscious, exhausting labor, their bodies slowly suffocating from the inside. The hospital room fell silent as the young man's chest stopped its desperate, shallow rise and fall. His body, once strong enough to work 12-hour shifts, had finally surrendered to lungs that could no longer draw air. A doctor pronounced the time of death, then turned to fill out the official certificate. In the cause of death section, his pen wrote a single, damning word: silicosis. That document, handed to a grieving family in a sterile corridor, became the first official record directly connecting a sandblaster's job to his fatal illness. It was a piece of paper that transformed a private tragedy into a public fact. Local health officials, alerted by the certificate, began pulling other files. They found more young men with the same diagnosis, the same occupation, the same grim trajectory. The investigation started quietly, with officials visiting the workshop where the young man had worked. They stood in the same dust-choked air he had breathed, noting the absent ventilation and the fine grey powder clinging to every surface. For the first time, the abstract medical term silicosis had a name, a face, and a place of origin. The machinery of inquiry, once sparked, began to turn. After that first death certificate was issued, the silence surrounding the workshops began to crack. Union representatives, their suspicions now hardened into action, entered those same concrete rooms where the air still shimmered with dust. They carried notepads and cameras, documenting what the factory owners had tried to conceal. Young men coughing into their sleeves, walls coated in a fine grey powder, and machines still roaring in the gloom. The investigators spoke with workers whose breath came in shallow gasps, recording their stories of 12-hour shifts inside the dust cloud. Then, carefully, they scooped samples of the abrasive sand from open sacks beside the equipment. This gritty evidence was sealed in clear bags, its journey from workshop floor to laboratory bench just beginning. Under the microscope, the truth became crystalline. Laboratory analysis revealed the sand was not an inert material, but nearly pure, sharp-edged crystalline silica, the very mineral that, when pulverized and inhaled, acts like microscopic glass shards shredding lung tissue. The Union now had physical proof linking the fashionable jeans directly to the poison in the air. The evidence gathered by unions and journalists finally landed on official desks in Ankara. In 2009, the Turkish Ministry of Health released a formal epidemiological study that could no longer be ignored. Its pages contained a devastating census, over 1,200 confirmed cases of silicosis, all traced directly to former denim sandblasters. The abstract numbers represented young men, now struggling for each breath. The report mapped the disaster across provinces, detailing how the disease had cut through a generation of workers in just a few years. It documented the rapid progression from cough to crippling fibrosis, the average age of diagnosis shockingly low. For the first time, a government body had officially connected the fashionable faded jeans sold in boutiques worldwide to a specific, documented trail of human ruin. Publication forced a long-delayed public reckoning. Newspapers splashed the ministry's findings across their front pages, translating clinical data into a story of national scandal. The official confirmation shattered any remaining denials from parts of the industry, creating an undeniable mandate for the state to act. The invisible poison had a name, a count, and now an unavoidable political consequence. The Ministry of Health report had forced the issue into the open. By March 2009, with public outrage growing and medical evidence undeniable, the Turkish government issued an emergency decree. The use of sandblasting for denim finishing was now officially and completely banned. The legal justification was clear. The process constituted an immediate and severe threat to worker health. Enforcement followed swiftly. Police units descended on the clandestine workshops that had operated for years in industrial zones. Officers in protective masks pushed open doors to reveal silent, dust-choked rooms. Their first action was to seize the machinery itself, the compressors, hoses and metal cabinets of the sandblasting guns, cutting off the source of the poison at its root. Next, they confiscated the raw material. In corners and storage rooms they found sacks and loose mounds of the fine, pale sand. This was the crystalline silica, the agent of the disease, now treated as contraband. The raids physically dismantled the industry, but for hundreds of young men, the damage to their lungs was already permanent and irreversible. After the workshops were shuttered, the silence that settled over them was broken by a different kind of noise, the rustle of legal documents and the determined footsteps of survivors heading to courthouses. Young men who once operated sandblasters now carried thick folders of medical records instead, their lungs scarred but their resolve hardened. They filed claims against the factory owners who had employed them, seeking compensation for lives cut short by the invisible dust. Inside the courtrooms, the air grew heavy with testimony. Pulmonologists took the stand, holding up X-ray films that glowed with ghostly white constellations against the dark lung fields. They explained how each tiny nodule represented a permanent scar where silica dust had triggered an inflammatory siege, transforming elastic tissue into rigid stone. Lawyers laid out pay stubs and work logs, tracing a direct line from specific clothing brands' orders to the workshops where the poisoning occurred. The lawsuits expanded beyond local employers to target international fashion houses whose demand for distressed denim had fueled the practice. Families of the deceased presented death certificates listing silicosis as the cause, their grief now channeled into a quest for accountability. Each case became a public chronicle of the disaster, ensuring that the medical files and the names within them would not be forgotten as the global industry quietly moved on. The courtrooms eventually fell silent, the legal battles settling into grim compensation agreements. Outside Turkey, major fashion brands quietly shifted their supply chains. By the mid-2010s, the industry had embraced new technologies to create that worn-in look. Factories now hummed with laser etchers that precisely burned patterns into denim, or used chemical baths to dissolve specific threads, methods that left no dust in the air. Back in the old industrial districts of Istanbul and Denizli, the sandblasting workshops stood abandoned, sunlight cut through broken windows, illuminating empty rooms where the roar of compressors had once been constant. A fine grey powder still clung to every surface, the walls, the floors, the silent machinery, a permanent residue of the silica that had filled workers' lungs. For the survivors, the damage was irreversible. Their scarred lungs could no longer expand fully, leaving them dependent on oxygen tanks and struggling with the most basic tasks. The global fashion trend had moved on, but in those empty workshops, the physical evidence of its human cost remained, settled into the dust on every silent, forgotten surface.